in, hang on a sec.
It tells me meeting is now streaming live on Facebook.
Yep, great. So welcome everyone to this JOSPT Asks live stream. My name is Claire Arndern. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of the JOSPT. And it's my really great pleasure to welcome Professor Lynn Snyder-Mackler to this JOSPT Asks live stream, everything you wanted to know on ACL injury and management and return to play. Welcome, Lynn.
Thanks, Claire. It's great to be trying this out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And we apologize for the couple of glitches in the last few minutes. So we promise that we'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can in the next hour. The idea is that today's session is really about connecting us all as a community. We're all going through a really tough time at the moment. We're all feeling, I think, a bit disconnected from our work, from our loved ones. And I think we hope this is a really great way to get our really vibrant community together, and they get the opportunity to ask you and have answered some really great questions.
That's terrific. Yeah, it is. It is very disorienting. Everybody being sort of locked away in their little pods, but we're all doing the right thing by staying apart. So.
Absolutely.
And you guys can all check how many times I touch my face during this.
And many of our community will have either met you in person, Lynn, or they will have had their work influenced by some of the fantastic research that you've conducted, clinical research in your career. So it's really wonderful to be able to launch this JOSPT Asks stream with you. So thanks for making the time.
Oh yeah, you're welcome.
I want to start by acknowledging the frontline health workers who are working so incredibly hard to protect our community and treat our community through this really tough time. So I want to extend our gratitude to them. I also want to send a special shout out to our friends in Spain and in Italy in particular. We're really thinking of you. And we're also really thinking of the students in our community who have really, who are going through a tough time, who are adapting in incredibly inspirational ways to new ways of learning and teaching, and who may have had their clinical practices interrupted through this coronavirus pandemic.
Yes.
So we're thinking of you too, and hopefully this is a fun way to break up the learning that you're doing right now.
Absolutely.
So let's get into our questions. I think we should start with some questions about managing ACL injury.
Sure.
So some of the questions that have come through on the Slido app. So if you want to post a question, go to slido.com, enter the event code ACL, and you'll be able to post your question, or you'll be able to vote up questions that you want answered. So we've got some questions here about who needs surgery and who doesn't. How do you make that decision? What are you considering, Lynn?
That is a super charged question, right? And it's one that almost doesn't get asked here in the US because the management is nearly always right to surgery. For I have an ACL tear, I'm going to have surgery no matter what. If I'm a 60-year-old who occasionally runs or a 14-year-old soccer player. So what our management algorithm, which is one that we've tested and been reporting on in the Delaware Oslo ACL cohort now for more than a decade, really involves a shared decision-making paradigm with our patients. So we bring our patients in preoperatively and we get their knees quiet so they have full range of motion, no swelling, good quad control. And then we do some preoperative progressive neuromuscular and strength training. And during that time period, we are discussing the options of return to complete a competitive season, prolonged non-operative treatment, like just choosing non-op as an option, and then surgery, and then obviously the different varieties of surgical treatments that you can do. So with that paradigm, these patients actually get a chance. Oh, also the other things that we talk about during that time are the actual outcomes of surgery, which are, especially if you're very active, you're going back to level 1 sports, is, you can look at about a 30% re-injury rate, right? So that it's not a cinch that you're going to have surgery and go back to sport, be playing at exactly the same level. As you know, your research was really one of the first that came out and gave us the real scoop on how many people do well. I think it's around half. Is that correct? So
yeah, around about that.
around that. So we give them that information, and then they make their own decisions in conjunction with their surgeon. And if it's a young, a child or an adolescent, in conjunction with their families and potentially coaches, things like that. And our results, we just finished up the 5-year data analysis, and one of the things that we see is these patients are all still very active at 5 years, 90+% of them, no matter which arm they choose of the algorithm. And it's actually really, I don't know, it's kind of invigorating. So you asked me about what tests we do, right? And so one of the things that we do at the end of that, mini prehab period that we do is we do pretty much the same tests that we do when we go to a return to play battery. We measure their quad strength. We do single leg hop tests, 4 of them. And then we give them some self-report questionnaires. So if these folks do well on those, we would consider them returning to sport or to complete a competitive season. Right? They have to,
okay.
But so that's the potential coper, right?
Okay, so let's pick up on this idea of the coper, because one of the questions that came through on Slido was, what is a coper? How do you define a coper? And you've written, I think you were probably one of the authors who coined that term in the ACL world. So can you describe what you mean by coper?
Yes, so we define a coper as someone, it is actually like a retrospective definition, right? You have to say someone who has returned to full activity for a year without an ACL and without re-injury. So early on, it's trying to figure out who's a coper, who could become one, who are the best candidates. And those candidates are really the people who have good dynamic stability as we measure them with these series of tests, right? They have good quad control, they're not swollen, their knee range of motion is great. They do well with this neuromuscular training, and their hop tests are terrific. And then but one of the things that we figured out is that the non-copers, the people who early on, with just this, we do 10 sessions of this progressive neuromuscular and strength training, and about half of the non-copers convert to potential copers just over those 10 sessions. And then it turns out, this was the paper that my postdoc, Louise Toma, who's now at University of North Carolina, her paper last year, that showed that the persistent non-copers, rather than doing better with surgery, they still do worse. So they may be the ones who actually need even more rehab before they have surgery, because they're not doing well no matter what.
And is this training program that you're doing, the 10 sessions of strength and neuromuscular training, are you calling that prehabilitation, or is prehabilitation something different? Because we hear a lot, I think, about prehabilitation. And one of the questions that we got was, what is it, and sort of how does it fit into a rehab program?
I would put it into two boxes. The sort of the typical prehab that we think about with ACLs is get the knee quiet so they can have surgery, right? Don't have them go in with a swollen knee that especially lacks knee extension. But once you get to the quiet knee, one of the things that we've shown is these additional 10 sessions of neuromuscular and strength training make a huge difference down the road. So it is typical quiet knee plus, right? That's what I would talk about. And we use perturbation training for R, which is, disturbing the support surfaces. But you could do any kind of progressive neuromuscular lower extremity training. It does not have to be the perturbation training. That's just how we standardized it in our hands.
Okay, nice. Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.
Let's move into, I think that's a nice segue into the early phase of rehabilitation. And I think one of the most challenging things, or the things that certainly I remember from physio school was drilled into me, was do not do open chain knee extension exercises with these people after an ACL reconstruction. Can you please share with us your thoughts on open chain knee extension and early phase rehab?
That is another great question. I'd like to kill that sacred cow right now. There is no reason to avoid doing open chain knee extension after ACL reconstruction. And that means even on day one. People have been talked about the strain on the graft and use that as an excuse or a reason actually to not do open chain exercise. Well, the studies out of the University of Vermont in the 90s actually showed that open and closed chain exercise have the same strain, somewhere between 3 and 6% in that range, depending on how much weight and the range of motion through which they're doing this, okay? Every time your patients take a step, the strain on the ACL is 13%. So if you're letting them walk, you can do open chain, you should be doing open chain quad exercises. If you let them do closed chain exercises, you should let them do open chain exercises. It's the same strain. And that strain is about a third to a half of what happens with every step that they take.
So does it matter? There's no restrictions on the range I can do these exercises through. There's no restriction on the resistance that I can use.
No, but you would start, obviously you're going to start light and work up as they tolerate it, but no. At least there's no evidence. There's no evidence that says you shouldn't be doing this. In fact, the preponderance of evidence is in the opposite direction. And you know, and I know, and everybody who's out there knows, we see these patients coming in all the time that have been cleared to return to sports, and they're 6 months out, and we measure them and they've got a 60% quad deficit. You know, Matt Ifburn's work that's been coming out at Laura Schmidt, the group from Ohio State, they've published several papers from this cohort of kids that came in when they were cleared by a health professional, and then had them sought to see how many of them passed these return to sport batteries. It's like 20%, something like that, 25% that have been cleared because no one ever looked. They didn't measure. So don't get me started on measurement.
Oh, we'll come to that, don't worry.
Yeah.
So I think the message here really is about strength, quads, quads. And I think you might have coined the phrase quads are queen or quads are king.
Bang, yep, quads are queen, quads are king, quads the magic muscle.
Yeah, nice. Yeah. I think one of the other things that sometimes can be challenging early in rehab is getting those quads going again.
Yeah.
And certainly you've published a lot on neuromuscular electrical stimulation, NMES. Yep. This is something, again, when I was going through physio school, this was something that we learned a little bit, but certainly wasn't emphasized. Can you share with us, we've had quite a few questions about what's NMES, when should we do it, how, why, what's the rationale? Can you share some thoughts about neuromuscular electrical stimulation?
Sure. So that I really got started in research because I really wanted to know why people's quads shut down after knee surgery. Like, I couldn't figure out how someone would go in and have a meniscectomy and the next day they forgot how to use their quads. I mean, you'd ask them to do a straight leg raise and they bend their knees. And you're like, what's going on here? Where's what's happened to this connection? All they did was take a little piece of something out of their knee and their quads don't work, or they can't work their quads. So stim is a really good way to get the quads like woken up, I guess. Inhibition is a big part of the early strength loss after knee surgery, any knee surgery. So if you can get that, if you can stim them early, you can really help get that information back to the brain. Yeah, this muscle does work, and help them volitionally be able to do it. So we do it right away, first day after surgery, and we continue to use the stim till their quad strength 80%. So that'll be an integral part of our treatment all the way up to when they have 80% quad strength. So
and is it just the quads? You're not stimming the muscle?
No, just the quads. And when we do it, you can, there are two different ways that have shown high intensity stim plus exercise being better than exercise alone. And one is if you can stabilize them in flexion in a dynamometer where you can actually measure the electrically elicited torque or force. Okay, so you're actually looking at the screen and you're turning up the dial and getting it to, the threshold is about 50% of the MVC. Okay. And then
MVC being maximal
voluntary contraction. Yep. Force. So that way you can know the dose isn't this electricity, not the milliamperage, it's the electrically elicited force or torque. But if you don't have that kind of a setup, Kelly Fitzgerald published a paper in, again, the early 2000s, where they just got the strongest possible contraction, that tolerable contraction with the knee in full extension on a treatment table. And that also was better than exercise alone. So, there's no reason not to stim the quads. And I think whenever you go to the people that I really admire that are out there doing a lot of really high quality continuing education, people like Mike Reinhold or Kevin Wilk, they're going to tell you stim the quads, stim the quads, stim the quads. It's just the best way to get things going.
And it's really interesting that you say you stim until you get to 80% limb symmetry. Again, it's like I think that initial thought is you're just using stims to get the quad going, and then after that you very quickly getting them into a leg extension machine or doing some ordinary strength training. But this sounds like you're using stims for a lot longer than perhaps what people might be expecting.
Yep, we are. Again, that's just following the research. It's at least, at the very least, you should do it through the early phases. But in our hands, at our clinic, at Delaware Physical Therapy Clinic, we do it till they have 80% strength.
Okay. All right. So let's move, I think, from some specific early phase questions and go and shift a little bit now to the return to running, because I think this is one of the earlier milestones that people find is important but can be a bit of a challenge. So what are the criteria that you use in Delaware for return to running after an ACL reconstruction?
Okay, so there'll be some now I'm going to talk about a couple different things, and as we go to return to sport, which we're going to get to, excuse me, there are biological milestones and, of course, intercurrent injury, right? So there are people who rehab really, really well, and they're strong and have a quiet knee, and they want to start running. Just because they meet the criteria, we're still going to hold them time-wise because we really do want that graft to heal. So the main criteria that we have are 60% quad strength. No, at least 60% quad strength, a quiet knee, full range of motion, no effusion. Okay, and we use a sweep test, a manual sweep test, to measure the grades of effusion. So trace to 0 effusion is really what we're talking about. And then we start them in a walk jog. right? So they'll be doing a walk jog on a treadmill in very controlled circumstances. And we monitor them for swelling, so increase in effusion, and knee pain, because knee pain, their knees shouldn't hurt. So, I mean, it's okay if their muscles hurt, but their knees shouldn't hurt. So if they start to do this and their knees swell up or their knees hurt, we've got to back them down. Okay, so presumably they've been walking around and doing but once they start to run, to jog really is what they're doing. And then we advance them. We've published this running program a bunch of different times, most recently in JOSPT in 2012, a paper by Doug Adams. So it's actually the soreness rules, the effusion testing, and the running progression are all in that article, which is open source at JOSPT. So it's a whole package. And then a sort of garden variety ACL with no other injuries, probably as early as 12 weeks, right? Somewhere in that range. But if they've had a chondral injury or a meniscus repair, have any concomitant ligamentous injury, it's going to be delay, right?
And so then you mentioned the walk, run on the treadmill.
Yep.
Then have you got some tips for how you sort of get beyond that? So are there specific exercises that you get them to do? How do you sort of progress them from treadmill, walk, run to what distance are you doing? And then how long should they wait, or how are you progressing?
So what we're trying to get them to do is to be able to jog or run on the treadmill for 2 miles continuously. And then we move them to a track where they'll run the straightaways and walk the curves. And then finally to road or field or court. So the progression's probably 2 months typically, start to finish. They starting in the clinic and moving. I mean, certainly people can do it faster, but it's on the order of a couple months, that sort of mid in clinic phase of ACL rehab.
Okay. We've also had a question come through on Twitter, I think, asking about tips for open chain exercises and closed chain exercises for the quads. And I'm thinking that we want to, now we've moved from early phase rehab, we're getting to return to run, now really into that middle part where we're trying to push strength and low resistance, high resistance, low load. Yeah. What kind of exercises are you prescribing at this period of time?
All right, so it sort of depends on what instrumentation you have, right? So almost everybody has a knee extension machine or a NK table, something that's, where you could put weights down near the ankle and have them, put the resistance down there and then have them just do open chain knee extension. So we do that. Classic low rep, high load. And the key there, though, is progression, right? So if they're able to do 3 sets of 10 pretty easily, then you've got to increase the weight. And that means you have to be paying attention, right? And really moving this up. So we see this very often where people are doing the same exact exercise over and over and over and over, and there's no progression. So the progression is really the important thing here. So you can do it on a knee extension machine. I guess you could do it with bag weights if that's all that you have, resistance bands, and then the other questions of dynamometers, isokinetic dynamometers, isometric dynamometers, and you can do so isotonics, isometrics, isokinetics, eccentrics are important too. So we basically throw the whole shooting match in it, and then people do leg press. Just be really careful about leg press early, because patients, you don't really need to use your quads to do a leg press. So if their quads are weak, they're going to use all kinds of other lower extremity muscles to be able to do it, and you're not going to get yourself anywhere. So I wouldn't make that the mainstay of my quads treatment.
And I think that's also an important thing to remember when you're testing strength too, because
Yep.
some people will go, oh, I can test a 1RM on a leg press.
Nope.
But you're much better off doing a 1RM on a leg extension, doing an open chain.
Absolutely. 100%. There was a nice paper by Anthony Sinecourt and his colleagues when he was at the University of Pittsburgh, and they actually tested handheld dynamometer with a like a mobilization strap, holding it to the table, one RM on the knee extension machine, limited range, like 90 to 45, and then full range, leg press. And then the gold standard was the isokinetic dynamometer. And they found that the 1RM was far and away the best. The others tended to overestimate the involved knees quad strength. And you don't ever want to do that, because then you discharge them, or you stop quad exercises earlier than you should, and you generally discharge them and clear them for play earlier.
Okay, so mid-phase, we're going strength, 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 quads, 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 but also not forgetting about the other major muscle groups like calves and hamstrings. Then, so let's move late phase now. So now we're starting to make that, or see that transition from the gym-based stuff onto the court or the field or whatever it is that the athlete is getting back to. During this time, how often are you checking in with an athlete? And how? So are you getting them to come into the clinic? Are you getting them to send you a text? How does that work?
So typically, all right, it sort of depends on what the athlete does and their play situation. So if they're playing in an environment where they have a strength and conditioning coach and a athletic trainer, we're going to transition them pretty early back to that side of the street. In our case, they're across the street from us. If they don't, that's another story. If they're really dependent on us for that, we'll probably see them more often. But we also can do some of this late stuff in groups, right? And they could also be discharged to a gym program. But we will, once we've discharged them, let's say it's 4 months, then we'll check them once a month, and generally bring, at least the first time and maybe the next, bring them in and make sure that we do a strength test. Because the one thing that we do see that's a harbinger of bad things to come is their quad strength goes down after they leave treatment. And so we want to really encourage them to keep that up. So that would be our biggest reason, I think, for a retooling. Come on back into the clinic for another couple weeks, is if their quad strength drops off.
Okay. And we had a specific question about when can a soccer player start light soccer training, but I think we can broaden that and say, when is it okay for an athlete to start making that transition back to doing stuff that looks like their sport and is in their sports environment? How do we manage, or how do you manage that progression?
So we do a return to activity battery of tests. We have quad strength, 4 single leg hop tests, single hop for distance, crossover hop, 3 crossover hops for distance, triple hop for distance, and a 6-meter timed hop. And then we use 2 self-report questionnaires, just a single question global rating of knee function, and the knee outcome survey activities of daily living scale. And they have to score 90% on all of those: quad strength, all of the hop tests, and the self-report questionnaires. At that point, they then begin this return to activity progression, or what our friend Stefano Della Villa would call on-field rehabilitation. So we get them out, and the very first step of that is agilities. And you want them to be able to do those agilities without any swelling and without any apprehension, right, or fear. You want to watch them go through that, but you also don't want them to have knee pain or swelling. So we're starting right there with that. And if they're able to go through the sort of standard agility battery, then we will progress them to going one-on-one, because the danger zone for ACLs is when you add an opponent, right? Nobody except like gymnasts and skiers really tear their ACLs when there's not an opponent, right? So that's something about adding that opponent really changes the game. So then we'll move to, yeah, no, pardon the pun, I guess. So one-on-one, then working with more players, and then finally a full practice with the team. So that's really, the return to sport testing that we do is really a return to their sporting activity, not a clearance to return to play directly. And then they have to go through that on-field portion, and then finally competition.
Yeah, and I think this is a really important thing to clarify, that return to sport and return to sport testing doesn't just mean that single test point, and it also doesn't mean that the athlete can't do anything before.
Yep, of course.
So go for it.
No, go ahead.
Okay. So I think we've covered one of the questions that got upvoted a lot on Slido was, what do you recommend as a return to sport test battery? How many tests and how many positive tests do you need? I think you just covered that, but can I get you just to say that for us once more again? Which are the tests and what's the criteria for the tests?
So we do quad strength, and I'll tell you that we're going to do quad strength first, because if their quad strength isn't anywhere near 90%, we're not going to bother to do the others. We'll just have them come back when their quads are stronger. Okay. And we'll do these tests every, month. It depends, how close they are. Right. But if they're within a couple of points, we might do it in 2 weeks. If they're off by a lot, then we're going to retool their home program, or maybe bring them back into the clinic and try and get that quad up to 90. And then we'll do the hop tests. So, and we do them as they were originally written by Dr. Frank Noyes, and we do them in the exact same order every single time. They get one practice, and then there are 2 live tests, and those are averaged. And then compared to we do and then compared to the uninvolved side. And then and then after they do that, we always do this the exact same way: quads, hops, and then they fill out the questionnaires after.
And what's the rationale for that, Lynn?
Because when we were doing the pre-op screening, what we found out is that often they hadn't done anything like this since their injury. So they really had no idea, like their self-report was off a lot. It was so much lower prior, if they did it before than if they did it after. So then we just started to do it in that order, and we're creatures of habit and pretty systematic at our clinic. And Tara Manal, our clinic director, likes to talk about reducing the variability of practice, right? Getting us to all do the same things well, and do the things that are very necessary well. So we do it the same way, and we still do. We've been doing it like that for, I don't know, a very long time, 20 years at least.
And those hop tests, you do single leg hop, triple hop, and then
crossover hop, and then
distance.
Their distance, and then the timed hop for 6 meters.
Yeah. And there are some folks who might be doing some different hop tests. They might be doing a side hop test.
Yep.
I think we can sort of let them know that that's okay.
Yeah, sure. I mean, part of the reason that the things that I like about these big hops, if it's hard to do. That the one thing is, it's hard to do if you don't have a space, but you really just need a 6 meter track. We've done it in hallways we did it for years in our old clinic. But if you think about what hop tests capture, they capture strength, they capture balance, and they capture confidence. So it really is a nice, and not just a standalone. I mean, we do this, like I said, we do this whole, there's aspects of things that are important in all of these, but I think you want to really challenge them in this return to activity battery of tests. Some people do, like, there are tons of different tests. Some people do even have a running component to it that they do. So go for it. Just make sure you have, you got to measure quad strength. That's the one thing that you have to do. And then other than that, you should get some feedback from them, the patients, about how they're feeling about their progress, and also some measure of function, a functional performance battery of tests. Pick your poison.
And so one of the questions, and I think it was our top voted question, or it is our top voted question, I can see it on Slido, is what return to sport tests would you recommend for a soccer athlete? I've got limited space and equipment. And I think we've answered that these tests are going to be what you're going to try and adapt to your space and equipment availability. And then are there going to be some other things that you might add in? How would you tailor that for a soccer athlete versus an American football player versus a skier?
Oh, skiers are different. We have to just say that it's a different animal. It's a different mechanism of injury. It's one of the only sports where novices tear their ACLs. Doesn't really happen to novices in other sports. So, I mean, I've had skiers who say, I'm not going to hop. I've never hopped in my life, right? So I would do other things that are more, we used to use those sliding boards. Remember when we had those in the clinics? And different things that would challenge. You'd have to use your imagination and challenge them in ways that would be more appropriate to their sport. In terms of American football and some of those big linemen probably have never hopped a day either, but we do the same. We do that same return to activity battery with all of our other sports. So we're, again, very, I guess, boring, doing the same thing over and over and over, but it's worked for us and has stood the test of time.
Yeah, and I think what might also be helpful for folks is to say, I've got this standard group of tests that I do that I can use with everyone, and then you might tailor something depending on the athlete who's in front of you, and that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great, actually.
Yeah. One thing we haven't mentioned is time.
Oh yeah, we have to talk about time. So we talked a little bit about time because we talked about return to running. And one of the things that we've, your papers and the registries, the international registries primarily, and then some of the American ones, we were quoting bad information. We were giving out bad information in the 80s and 90s and even the early 2000s. About the success after ACL reconstruction. We were saying, oh, everybody's going to return to sport and there won't be any re-injuries. And what we found is that does not happen. And the re-injury rate, it was alarmingly high and is tied to return to level 1 sports, jumping, pivoting, and cutting sports. So one of the things that, again, this is one of those, we never looked. Right? The reports were coming from the surgeon's office, and it was based on their patients who went out of their office and then didn't come back. So they assumed they're all doing fine, right? Well, some of them weren't doing fine, and some of them didn't come back to that doctor. They went to another doctor, right? Or maybe they didn't go to a doctor at all. Again, so we really did, till groups like yours started really looking at it. And I'm sure, I know the surgeon whose data you were looking at, and I'm sure he was alarmed at the beginning when you actually looked at the data and he said, wait a minute, what's happening here? Everybody else says there's a 2% failure rate or an 8% failure rate. Why is this happening? And it turns out everybody's got the same data, and your numbers and the numbers from Mark Paterno at Cincinnati Children's and the data from our data, the Scandinavian data, they all matched within percentage points, like just a really small variability. So I think that got us trying to think of what are we doing wrong, and what I think we were doing wrong is we were playing this name that tune was an old game, right? I can name that tune in 3 notes. I can name it in 1, right? That people were actually, you had therapists and surgeons basically competing with one another, saying, I can get you back in 6 weeks. I can get, not 6 weeks, but you get my drift. 3 months, 5 months. And I think for a very long time, the standard for clearance was about 6 months. And what we know now is that's way too early. The data from our cohort, I think really the most impactful paper I think we've ever had, at least the biggest clinical impact right away, was Hege Grindham's paper in 2016 that showed a big change. If you hold them out to 9 months, you drastically decrease the re-rupture rate. And our data actually, if you look at the graph, looks about the same out to 12 months, but we didn't have enough statistical power to do that. So my recommendations now for my patients is if at least 9 months, and if they're 18 and under, a year. And that allows, there's some really nice work from Constance Chu at Stanford. She's a scientist and an orthopedic surgeon. And she has done these serial MRIs looking at graft healing. And you can really just see the graft mature over these time periods. And really, it's out to about 24 months, the graft is still maturing. There are some people who have these nice, beautiful grafts at 6 months, but that's not the norm. So that's the time part. But biology matters.
Yeah, I think it does. And so the critical times here, I think, are minimum 9 months, and particularly with your younger athletes, really trying to hold them for a bit longer, until at least a year.
Yeah. And then, then we get into your bailiwick of the ACL-RSI and the questionnaires that are talking about confidence and fear and self-efficacy in some cases. This gives you some time at that tail end of rehab to really help them recover as a whole person, and then be ready to participate in sports. But we talk about the fearfulness. Often that fearfulness is because their knee doesn't feel right and they're not adequately rehabbed. So you get a little bit more time with that. On the other side, we've had like the flip side of the fearful patient is this super confident patient who races through rehab, scores super high on all the questionnaires, including the return to sport, the ACL-RSI, and they go back to sport early. They get out on the field and re-tear, right? Because they meet every single milestone and go. Those are the people we really have to hold off. And we have to be very, very imaginative in what we do with them in that terminal, that end part of rehab, to just hold them back. So for me, this is young girl athletes, young women's soccer, young girls, actually, not even women. They're kids who are soccer athletes, who are these super confident, who have hamstring grafts, right? Because they fit that, and so they race through, and they don't have the extensor mechanism issues that patellar tendon and quad tendon grafts have. So they tend to get their quad strength back faster, and they just want to return. I think that's something that we really need to hold them back. So 9 months. If they're young, I keep them out a year.
And again, 9 months doesn't mean you can't do any sport until 9 months.
It means no live. I take something from baseball pitching. No live pitches, right? Not right. No game.
Yeah, so your restrictions are going to be until 9 months or 12 months, but you're going to be doing some restricted participation, whether it's working on your own, whether it's doing some restricted decision making with an opponent, and then gradually progressing to 9 months. If you're passing all of those criteria, that's when we start to then progress. And it's not like you flick the switch at 9 months and go, oh, now you can play 90 minutes in a soccer match.
That's correct. No, we don't.
So again, it's a progression.
And again,
I think that's a really important message.
Remember, as sports physios, our job, and the surgeon's job also, is to our clearance is really to say the patient is safe to return. So they might not be physically up to snuff in terms of maybe their cardiovascular conditioning or many things that have to work to be able to play with their teams. But the other thing about that, though, is once we determine this safety, they're released to the care of their team. And then you have the coach or the manager, whoever it is, might say, this is a really great player, and this player playing at 50% is better than anybody else I have in that position on this team. So I'm going to, he'll play earlier. Does that make sense? So once we have to make sure that we've done our job and said, okay, it's safe for you to go back. And after that, you've got to let it be a coaching decision and stay out of it. Because if you don't think they're safe, you shouldn't clear them, right? So that's
and
where
again, we're coming back to this shared decision-making, multidisciplinary team where ideally you would have a coach involved in that decision-making process.
A little bit, yeah. I mean, I don't want the coach affecting timing for me of the safety part. So I would like the coach to stay out of the decision until that time when we've decided that it is safe for this person to go back. And I'm not going to get involved in his coaching either. So
yeah, goes both ways.
Yep.
We touched on psychological readiness just before.
Sure.
And again, I want to just come back to that because we had a couple of questions about psychological readiness and specifically measuring it. And you mentioned the ACL RSI.
Yep.
Is that the tool that you're using in the clinic, or how are you assessing psychological readiness? What's your best tips for assessing psychological readiness?
We use the TSK-11, Tampa Scale Kinesiophobia, and the ACL RSI. And they actually measure different constructs, right? So when I think about kinesiophobia, I think about that early in rehab. Those patients who are really afraid to move, they're the ones who end up with, they have stiff knees, their quads aren't working. They're very timid about their rehabilitation. The ACL RSI is really for more later in rehabilitation, and that's about how do you feel about returning to play, right? Returning to your sport. And some of that, I think, sort of at the tail end, if in fact they are well rehabbed, and by that I mean have met all those other criteria, strength, et cetera, then you might be able to use some like psychologically informed physical therapy to help them get to the finish line. Does that make sense? But I don't see the people are afraid to move are my early problem, and afraid to go back to sport is a late problem. Often those people who are afraid to return to sport, who score poorly on the ACL RSI, I know there's a short form now, we haven't switched over to that yet, but those folks are not adequately rehabbed. So you have to go back to the fundamentals and make sure they've got full range of motion, their strength is good, they're not swelling, they don't have any knee pain, blah, blah, blah. Once you're sure that you've got those fundamentals done, then it's time to start to talk to them about what is it that you're afraid of, and try and work through that with them, with the data, which honestly can be a little scary.
Yeah, and I think this is where particularly the ACL RSI, or ACL Return to Sport After Injury scale that was developed by Professor Kate Webster in Melbourne in Australia, that I think there's some really nice questions in there in that they do open up that conversation with the athlete. It's
the risk about the risk appraisal questions there's some that are more about how they see what the risks are.
Exactly. And the other nice thing I think about the ACL RSI is it's been now translated into so many languages.
Absolutely.
So it's in English, it's in Swedish, it's in Norwegian, it's in German and Dutch and Turkish and French. So I think a lot of folks are going to be able to find a version of it that suit the population that they're working with, which is one of the challenges, I think, for our international community sometimes with questionnaires. And
a nice thing is, Kate has not made this available to people free of charge, which is another, something that I really, really appreciate.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kate. That's great. We're getting close to our hour, so I'm conscious about wrapping up on what's been such a really great conversation. And I'm going to come back to, I think, a question about rehab and the environment. We're sitting here recording this where many folks are under on lockdown or asked not to leave their homes as much as possible. So what are some exercise programs or tips for exercises that folks can recommend for their patients in this challenging environment that we're living and working in at the moment?
Well, I think we are so lucky right now that we have the technology that we have. So I would say that, I mean, I get, even during regular rehab with patients, during regular times, I'll get updates from them on their phone. They'll send me a picture of the knee or a text or something and saying what they're doing, right? But we can do that really formally now. You could probably even do a Zoom class where you have, a whole bunch of if your patients are all in sort of the same time post-op, you can be doing some things with them. So I think the early part of rehab is kind of a little bit easier to do at home without a lot of equipment, but later, the latter part is harder. I mean, you can do isometrics really easily. You can do squats. What's hard is to get that open chain quad exercise. So I think resistance bands, backpacks with weights in them, anything you can do to make a resistance for them to be able to do it, and then guide them through. There are tons of right now. If you're on social media, you'll see that there are a lot of therapists who are making all different kinds of exercise videos and exercise progressions that they're actually just laying out their libraries of them for people to be able to use. And so I would suggest that you go on. If you look at the people who follow me on Twitter, there's a ton of them that are doing this kind of stuff. And I really appreciate what they're doing. I mean, it's, again, they're just making it available to people. So, and I'm always amazed when I look at these, how imaginative these wonderful clinicians are. The things that they come up with, I wouldn't even think that I had in my house, but of course I do. And it's to all of our patients' benefits.
Absolutely. And I want to give a bit of a shout out to Christina Lee at the moment. So Christina's at University of Alberta doing her PhD there. Yeah. She's also been doing some fantastic Twitter posts on group exercises. Yeah. Her program's called FAST, F-A-S-T. So if you search for Christina Yeg Physio, I think. Oh, I'm sorry, Christina. I should know your Twitter handle off the top of my head. If you
can find
search for Christina on Twitter, you will find her. I'm pretty sure she's Yeg Physio, but she's posting some really cool stuff at the moment. Yep. So she's an example. But as you say, there are many others who are doing really cool stuff. And our community, how cool is our community? We help
everybody's
each other
sharing.
out.
Everybody's sharing. I'm going to find Christina's thing for you.
So I think we've got 1 or 2 minutes left. Yep. And I'm thinking, let's start to wrap up. Yep. So we started off in the decision-making process. We talked about how ACL management, decisions for surgery or no surgery is
Yeg Physio, Claire.
I was right. Yeg Physio.
Y-E-G Physio, one word.
And the YEG comes from Edmonton Airport Code. I do remember that. So we started off talking about the decision-making process and about how you are talking with athletes, that certainly this early period of trialing some really good training to see whether people are going to be able to cope, quote unquote, with this knee injury. Then we moved on to early phase rehab. Open chain quads exercises are fine.
Thumbs up.
Yep. Load the quads within the patient's tolerance. Yep. Then we moved on to neuromuscular electrical stimulation, and I know that you're a big proponent of that. Yep. So if
stim the quads, load the quads, stim the quads.
Yes, quads are king or queen.
Yep, queen.
Depending on your preference. Yeah. Yep. Then we went on to, in our middle phase where you're transitioning back to running, some really great tips about making sure that knee is quiet, getting quad strength before you start to then progress with some walk running on the treadmill, and then moving on through the progression back to running. And again, quads, strength.
Yeah.
I think if we can underline one thing from this hour session, it's really quad strength.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to get that word out. Thanks for helping.
Pleasure. Then, so in our late phase, this is that progression, that challenging, or what can be a challenging time, but certainly some great tips on gradually helping that athlete progress from more restricted to unrestricted. And then you shared all your great tips on return to sport testing, return to sport test batteries, this constant question of time versus criterion. I think we can safely say that
it's both.
biology matters.
Yeah, it's both.
Yeah. So I think, Lynn, this has been a fantastic hour. I want to thank you so much for sharing your wealth of knowledge from the clinic and from research with our community.
That's great. And Claire, thank you for making this happen. This was is a bright spot in a very challenging time for all of us.
No, it's a pleasure. So thanks to everyone for joining. The link to this hour-long chat will be available shortly on our Facebook page. We'll also post the link on our other social media channels, so you'll be able to find it. Please share it with colleagues and friends and family members who might have missed this session. There's lots of great information there. Please tell your friends and family and colleagues if you found this helpful, and help others to find us. If you go to Slido, you'll get to a poll. We'd really love your input. Please rate us, give us a rating. How helpful was this session? It helps us to refine what we do in our next JOSPT Asks sessions. And our next session is going to be same time, same place, next Thursday. We've got Sarah Haig from Entropy Physio is going to be our special guest, talking about all things pelvic health, pelvic physiotherapy. So please join us 12 p.m. Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern, next Thursday, the 2nd of April. You can go to Slido now and start posting your questions. Thanks very much. And thanks, Lynn.